As Nancy Fisher comes up to light our chalice, a symbol of our faith, I invite those of you at home or online to light your own chalice, if you have one at home. And I invite you here to rise in body or spirit as we speak aloud the affirmation that is printed in your order of service. You'll find the words on the chat line as well. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need, for these high purposes do we unite in worship.
Great spirits, fill us with the light, give us the strength to understand and eyes to see. Teach us to walk the soft earth as relatives to all that live. This is a Sue prayer.
And now, I have a reading by an early Universalist minister, Olympia Brown, and she demonstrates in this reading how important her Universalist faith was to her. Stand by this faith, work for it, and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before us the loftiest ideals, which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, that you are strong enough to work for a great, true principle without counting the cost. Go on finding ever new applications of these truths and new enjoyments in their contemplation, always trusting in the one God which ever lives and loves. Words by Olympia Brown, who you're going to meet in a few minutes. March is Women's History Month. I recently saw a headline which refreshed my memory about the origin of this recognition. The headline read, "Women's History Month grew out of a week-long commemoration by Jimmy Carter in 1980. In declaring this celebration, Carter reminded the nation that, quote, too often women are unsung and their contributions unnoticed. I'd forgotten that about Jimmy Carter. This focus on women's recognition started out as a week, as part of International Women's Day. And then in 1987, Congress passed the first National Women's History Month, and a presidential proclamation affirming this recognition has continued every year since then. Of course, Americans recognize many identity-based months and celebrations in addition to women. Black History Month, Transgender Day of Remembrance, Hispanic Heritage Month, and many more. Now, it could be argued that we should remember and honor these various identities every day of the year. And still, these special celebrations do help us to create special projects and also offer reminders about honoring these identities, which were previously ignored or marginalized. In 1987, there was little in the way of women's studies programs in schools and in public consciousness. I find that really hard to believe. I still remember in my former career in academia, in 1987, the first paper on women in music history came to one of our conferences, and it created such a brouhaha, that we were addressing women, 1987. In some ways, by now, 2023, we can say that we've come a long way, baby, at least recognizing women. On the other hand, as we've been reminded in the sand demonstration, there's been so much backlash in the past few years to women's freedom, to women's rights, in the aftermath of new legislation around abortion. Or with the reminder just this past week, did you catch it in the news, that women's earnings overall remain at 82% of what men earn? We must ask, how well is the United States honoring this insightful proclamation from President Carter? President Biden recently said, despite significant progress, women and girls continue to face systemic barriers to full and equal participation in our economy and our society. As President Carter sadly nears the end of his life, I hope that we can honor him well by continuing all the ways he has nurtured goodness and equity and compassion for everyone. Our future generations, as well as the women who came before us, need this recognition. To continue gender-specific focus on women's rights and women's freedom is not at all wasted effort. The liberal faith of Unitarian Universalism is especially informed by social context, especially on how we promote and live out justice for all, no matter particular identities. Unitarian Universalists have long and strong traditions of many identity-based ministries, as we call them. That is, habits of information and organizing and governance and community building which embrace awareness of personal characteristics of its participants, characteristics such as defined by gender or race or sex or economic status or physical ability, and more. Thus, in 2017, for instance, the denomination was intentional about electing not only a new president, but the first woman president, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. And in 2023, the General Assembly coming up, it is known that we will elect the first Black woman president because it's an uncontested election. There's only one person on the ballot. As part of the Unitarian Universalist Association, there are many identity organizations for Black Lives UU, referred to as BLUE, Black Lives UU, or transgender religious professionals, a group called Trust, or the long-lived UU Women's Federation, which some of you may have been members of or continue to be members of. As part of the ministerial search process, this congregation will be engaging in a UU workshop called Beyond Categorical Thinking, a workshop which is intended to help you examine whether there are any conscious or unconscious biases you might hold about the identity of ministers. So identity matters in this denomination. But still, we might ask, why should religion define itself through these various lenses of identity? Isn't it enough just to engage in governance or theology or history or ministerial activities, ministry activities without these particular slants or orientations? I respond to my own question by saying that if religion is a human construct based on life experiences, then our particular identities influence how we construct religion and theology. Taking women's lenses as an example, in the mid-20th century, during second wave feminism, women began to advance feminist theology in order to construct the concept of God as woman. I still recall the title of an early feminist theology book by a woman called A God Who Looks Like Me. This was revelatory. And similarly, Black liberation theology presents God as Black. Queer theology centers non-binary, queer reading of sacred texts, and so much more. And lest I pass over the obvious, most standard theologies written before we began to apply identity awareness were also identity-based. We just didn't call them that. Before probably the 1950s or the 1960s, the middle of the 20th century, it was largely white, privileged males writing theology and scripture. Who do you think created an image of God in the first place? As an old white man with a beard, sitting high on a throne of privilege. Indeed, we construct religion in our own human image. We may also assume gender languages to interpret history, family and biological history, national history, religious and congregational history. Knowing where we are coming from inspires our moving forward. An important inspiration for me is knowing more about the women who came before me in my family, in the liberal faiths of Unitarianism and Universalism, which we are based on. My sisters in liberal ministry were inspired by their faith. We heard that in the reading by Olympia Brown, who said, "Stand by this faith." To commit to social reform, many more uppity and conscientious women than I can ever hope to be made the world a better place. They advocated. They tried to make waves in abolition, in temperance, in women's rights, in prison reform, in labor laws, in medical practices. They established missionary movements. They came from relatively prosperous families, and so our foremothers tended to be pretty well educated, skilled in writing and in publishing, so they knew how to get the word out there to promote their agendas. They coalesced power by networking with one another. And yes, they were often described as stepping out of their place. That is, out of the proper sphere for women who were supposed to remain docile and not making trouble. So today, let's meet, through their words and their images, some of the 19th century uppity women in liberal faith, on whose shoulders all of us stand today. All of us of any gender, any orientation. Perhaps some of the women we're going to meet are better known to you than others. And perhaps you didn't realize that some of these women were Unitarians or Universalists, such as Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony may be among the best known of uppity women. Her slogan was, "Failure is impossible." She's famous for her leadership in women's suffrage and her face on dollar bills, on silver dollars. But did you know that Susan B. Anthony was a Unitarian? She was raised in a Quaker family, but her family switched to the Unitarians in Rochester, New York, when their particular Quaker meeting didn't take a stand against slavery. Susan B. Anthony delivered hundreds of speeches during her long life with words such as,
"We ask for women justice and equality, equality with man. We ask for the removal of many customs and laws that prevent the exercise of all her God-given powers, the entire freedom of thought, word, and action that man claims for himself. The man teacher receives a salary of $1,000 per year, while the woman, possessed with equal or better qualifications by nature and education, is paid but $400.
From Susan, listen to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Many reformers worked in several reforms simultaneously. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a Black Unitarian from Philadelphia, called for unity in reform as we hear her call with these words.
"We are bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. Society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the course in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries and crippled his moral strength. When the hands of the black man were fettered, white men were also deprived of liberty. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members.
Let's meet Judith Sargent Murray. Early Americans encouraged education for everyone, but some thought women should study softer subjects, arts, language, writing. Other women countered that gender did not influence mental capacity. One of the earliest calling for educational reform was Universalist Judith Sargent Murray, the wife of John Murray, who I've talked about in a recent sermon, an early Universalist minister. In the 1770s, Judith held radical views on education. She wrote,
Are we, women, deficient in reason? We can only reason from what we know. And if opportunity of acquiring knowledge has been denied us, the inferiority of our sex cannot fairly be deduced from this. What can a woman do? She's not supposed to read books, or if she does, she can read only novels, lest she get a reputation as a learned lady. Is it reasonable that a candidate for heaven, an intelligent being, should at present be so degraded as to be allowed no other ideas than those which are suggested by cooking a pudding or sewing the seams of a garment?
Back to Olympia Brown. A century later, after Judith Sargent Murray, women were still calling for equality in education. Universalist Olympia Brown, one of the first women ordained to ministry, wanted women's education to be useful.
Some say that women will no longer be angels if brought in contact with the rude world. But the United States of 1874 is not a very favorable place for angels anyway. So an angel would be sadly out of place and very uncomfortable.
Mary Livermore worked for racial justice. Our women ancestors also railed against slavery, which they often compared to their own status as slaves to a white male establishment. Nearly all anti-slavery societies included women who aided fugitives on the Underground Railway. One of the most well-rounded reformers was Universalist Mary Livermore. She delivered hundreds of lectures during her career. One of them, called "What Shall We Do with Our Daughters?" supposedly she delivered over 700 times. She ardently opposed slavery, which she learned the horrors of when she lived on a plantation in the South. She wrote,
How clearly I realized that the people at the North knew nothing of the institution of slavery. I had heard them define it and depict it as a humane organization, how utterly they failed to comprehend its brutalizing influence on the finest characters or dreamed of the outrages inflicted on the poor blacks.
Julia Ward Howe opposed war, and many other women detested the war. They lost husbands and sons to battle. They joined Julia Ward Howe in calling for peace. Howe moved in Unitarian circles in Boston after marrying the abolitionist Samuel Gridley Howe, with whom she shared a very tumultuous marriage. Perhaps you know Howe best for the song Battle Hymn of the Republic. I don't know if kids still sing that in school, do they? I remember it was in our blue songbook, Battle Hymn of the Republic. She wrote the text for this after reviewing troops on the Civil War battlefield. Her advocacy for peace led to the founding of Mother's Day through these words which she penned in 1870.
Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of water or of fears. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own, saying, disarm, disarm.
Clara Barton was another peace activist, a Universalist, who founded the American Red Cross. In a speech in 1879, Clara Barton honored women.
American women, how proud I am of you. How proud I have always been since those days to have been a woman. Abraham Lincoln said that without the help of the women, the rebellion could not have been put down, nor the country saved. Since that time, I have counted all women citizens.
In ministry, Florence Crooker. Somewhat ironically, religion was among the last areas of women's reform. Some activists insisted the Bible supported the rights of all humans. That is, there is neither male nor female. While others saw the Bible as the cause of women's subordination. Universalists and Unitarians ordained the first women, well over 100 by 1920, the year of the vote. An early Universalist minister was Florence Crooker, who argued in a newspaper article in 1914 that St. Paul himself would approve of women ministers and tell them not to keep silent in church.
The question is sometimes asked, why should there be women ministers? The answer is plain, for the same good reasons that there is a male ministry. That is, to spread the gospel, to give religious instruction, to train the young in the ways of virtue and righteousness, in brief, to help the world.
Finally, Lydia Jenkins, for whom I have yet to find a photo. Lydia's style changed the scope of ministry. Women added religious education, pastoral care, and social outreach to the male paradigm of theological analysis and preaching. I've just completed a biography of the Universalist woman named Lydia Jenkins, who I'm claiming as the first woman ordained with national authority in any denomination in 1860. Lydia was lost to the history books, and I'm reviving her story. I wish I could revive her image, but I have yet to find one of her. She not only broke boundaries by being the first ordained, she was among the first to apply gender to theology in what she called the feminine element. She wrote this: "Years ago, I clearly saw ministry open before me, and I knew it would be wrong to shirk from my duty. With a very imperfect preparation, I entered upon the work, and in regard to the kind of influence which ought to be exerted in that preparation, I entered the ministry with soul, might, mind, and strength. I everywhere preached to the people. The prevalent theology of Christendom convinces me that there is a need of an infusion of the feminine element in theology." Lydia Jenkins. And after the service, I'll offer reflection time to tell you more about my work and my book on Lydia Jenkins. So please come back at 11:30. You can learn more about that and more about Yellowstone Park if anybody wants to hear as well. That's not a women's issue, Yellowstone Park. Our uppity foremothers stepped out of their place, and they were proud to do so. How do you honor this heritage? Do you speak out? Especially in these times when rights to privacy and the very foundations of American democracy are threatened? Let us all earnestly believe that failure is impossible. Let us honor the heritage of all those who came before us by continuing to advance goodness, trust, freedom, and love in this world which so desperately needs the goodness and the freedom that our faith can offer. May all this be so.